always a hard thing to do is to live up to any form of expectation. Especially an expectation that in many people's eyes could be considered not just controversial, but certainly for us has created many challenges throughout the government of this state and the federal government. Dumbarton has many times been under attempts of assassination to stop the voice, to stop the ability to be able to, as Indigenous people, to get our voice out across the world. That's what's happened to a whole race of people. And I just want to firstly say it's good to see my African Queen here today. And I do want to go back to black. And what a woman. This is for the frightened people in the world in entering into scary places looking for things that they will never find. In 2010, Dumbarton was awarded a significant assessment for our gallery called Kayana. On site next to our main office area from the federal government, including the Prime Minister and Cabinet, the National Library and the National Archives. 6 months later, by means of deceit, we were cleverly evicted from the facility, where our heritage and our identity were so proudly displayed. We had a problem with the inner ceiling, which the Indigenous Land Corporation, the landlords, stated that they would repair, and we needed, just for the moment, to take all of our painting objects and sacred objects out from the gallery until it was repaired. There were over 3,000 separate objects and over 350 sacred objects that were kept in a non-public viewing room that was inside the main gallery. Some of these objects were so old that the ceremonies that they were used in are no longer active or carried out in this country. We received a letter from the National Chairperson and the then State Director of ILC stating that Dumbarton did not have the financial security nor the resources to access the facility, so we had to arrange an alternative space requirement. I told the Indigenous Land Council that we had nowhere appropriate to keep the sacred material safe and protected. They said they would arrange a metal box for the items, as some of them were in excess of 6 feet long and thousands of years old. The next morning there was a tradies toolbox left at the front of the door. I then rang the State Director, who said, "Yes, that's the package box." I told him that the only place that we could store these objects that was far enough away from the public as possible was inside the toilet ablution in our office. He then stated, if that's the case, do it. My reply to him was, "Are you serious? Do you want and expect us to store ancient sacred objects of our religious ceremonies in the shithouse?" He replied, "Wherever." Dumbarton then commenced a worldwide petition against this most disrespectful and disgraceful action. It was a cultural crime committed against our people and our beliefs. A comment from the significant assessment report carried out by Dr. Brian Shepherd and Paul Bridges stated clearly that the Kayana Gallery, run by the Dumbarton Aboriginal Corporation, has become a tangible centrepiece from the campus in which Dumbarton reaches out into the wider community. Increasingly, it is being understood that museums and collections that contribute to a social good are those that are most likely to survive into the future. Having such a strong sense of social purpose and with a demonstrated history of having made a difference in many people's lives, Dumbarton amply meets this criterion. Dr. Brian Shepherd. I've had the opportunity to travel to many international museums and galleries. I have visited the Smithsonian Institute, the Museum of Mankind in Canada, the Fowler Museum, the University of California, and many, many others across Australia, and of course here in Western Australia. I've seen literally thousands of Aboriginal artefacts and sacred objects, and I've always thought, how has so much of our cultural material ended up in places like this? Spoils of war, stolen or otherwise. You can begin to see how our culture, spirituality and our old people's way of life was quickly exterminated and decimated. In many ways, museums equate to cultural appropriation. Our members of the Dumbarton Aboriginal Corporation, through our chairperson here today, would like to acknowledge Mr. Alec Cole for taking the chance. To Corinda, my beautiful daughter, who taught me that beauty should never be in prison. And on the other side of the fire of intimacy, I see my own reflection of love. And I give my acknowledgement to a person who has helped so many young women come back from the shadow of darkness and live again. To my wife Selena, you are truly the inspiration of Dumbarton. We have today with us brought, commonly known as a boomerang in our language, a kylie, from our collection. This kylie is over 300 years old. So it was made before any white people had ever entered from the tall ships onto our land. In our gallery, when we put these old objects into the hands of our young people to see what happens within their spirit when they connect with their proper and true culture, is a most amazing spiritual experience. And I know the very thing that was taken away from us as people to conquer, to colonise us, is the very thing we need to put back into the lives of our young people to make them resilient and strong again. And that's, of course, our proper customary cultural practice. I'm honoured to be here today, and to all the international guests, welcome to the world's most beautiful city. It's a shining diamond in the great southern land. It's a testimonial to architectural magnificence. It's a city that encroaches on the shorelines of a river steep in history and beauty. Welcome to Perth, the most racist city in the most racist country in the world. It has no soul nor spirit. It's void of humanity, and it's built on massacre sites and our burial grounds. It slithers in the blood of our ancestors. It's full of racial hatred, bigotry and bitterness. The rest you will hear from others will be nothing but a lie. Jungabinya Bomiga, the smell of the white man is killing us, was stated by Yagan's mother, who saw her people dying as they breathed in the diseases of the white man. As our communities plunge into darkness and chaos, I would like to give a tribute to the following. For those harmless, innocent and peaceful souls who have been dragged into dark, damp prisons. For those who have had their children stolen away. For those who are facing the hell and the despair of severe addiction. And to you, our young ones, who are about to walk into the darkness and fly, may you see the fires of our old people burning in the distance, that will guide you to your bliss that you so desperately seek. In the darkness of where you just can't turn back. Know that we love you, and our weapons are made strong for you. And especially to those of our young and frail who at this very moment are having their innocence shattered at the hands of monsters. May our campfires for you burn forever. I spoke at a forum here in this very room some 12 years ago on a panel regarding incarceration with Graham Dixon, rest in peace, who was able to put his ink to visibility, and he wrote the extraordinary books Holocaust Island and Holocaust Island Revisited, an underground writer, an enemy of the state. The most important statement that I could make here today is that we as people should demand immediately to crush the most brutal portal of the British Empire's genocide on the shores of our land, the Roundhouse, and backfill it so it's never again seen by the innocent eyes of young children who understand it only as a tourist attraction, and grow into adults not knowing any more or less. The absolute disrespect of this massive holding cell of hell today being used as a place of theatre, marriage ceremonies, parties, recording artists and guided tours is a human corruption of the spiritual warfare between what is the truth of this country's nationhood of history and its hidden deceitful lies and smears of deceptive fabrications. You either stand with the oppressor or you stand with the oppressed. There is no place of innocent convenience of ignorance or deception of time somewhere in between. Not far off our shoreline is one of West Australia's greatest promoted tourist destinations, Rottnest Island, one of the world's most effective concentration camps of war, where our men were shackled and chained and dragged to die without cause or reason, other than the colonisers wanted the lands in which they occupied. The cells where our men died are now cabins and holiday motel rooms. They eat from what was once the morgue, or more akin to a slaughterhouse, where the skeletal remains of our people's bones and skulls were sent to the world's laboratories for scientific human examination and turned into macabre souvenirs, as many skulls of our once great warriors have been repatriated with cigar-stained stumps from the European houses of aristocrats. This island should be immediately closed to the public and developed into a place where people can visit on a daily basis to learn about the history of what happened to our people. Something similar to Robben Island off the coast of South Africa, or Auschwitz. This is the humanly decent and the only development that should happen at Wanjama, the place of spirits. It's time for your party to stop. Aboriginal affairs is a scandal and industry that is exploited by bureaucrats and non-Aboriginal interests. There are direct threats to our self-determination, and it's controlled by ensuring that the Prime Minister and Cabinet's Indigenous Advancement Strategy, funding of just over $5 billion over a 4-year period, reaches the community at less than 10% of the dollar, after it's been squandered and intentionally awarded to massive industries such as universities, AFL interests, big NGOs, local and state government funding bodies, church groups, private sector groups, including exclusive Catholic schools. This funding is awarded to attempt to eliminate the gaps between non-Aboriginal advantage and Aboriginal disadvantage, between the key areas of jobs, land and economy, children and schooling, safety and well-being, cultural capabilities and remote Australian strategies. On the first, they have failed miserably. The vast majority of Aboriginal people have fewer jobs than any other race. Aboriginal people have no structured body of a Commonwealth. On the second, they have failed miserably. Schooling and educational needs are as dismal today as they have ever been. On the third, they have failed miserably, as the safety and the well-being of our people's most vulnerable, our women and our children, are statistically proven to be much greater than the average Australian. The 1905 Western Australian Native Welfare Act was a declaration of war. The kidnapped children of the stolen generations that went on to work as slave labour for flour, sugar and tea, forced to become state wards under the Act, the United Nations should have condemned the Australian government and its policies at that time to the International Courts of War Crimes and charged them with human trafficking and the slavery of Indigenous people. Australia is the only country in the world that ever passed a legislative law that gave the government the right to forcibly remove children from their parents. Babies still suckling on the mother's breasts were ripped from her arms. This never happened in apartheid South Africa, nor the Americas. The residential schools, regardless of how difficult they made it for the Indigenous people, in Canada and America, they still could visit their children at will. However, here, the children never saw their parents ever again. All Aboriginal people were made state wards in Western Australia under the Act. The Act centred its active focus on assimilation by dispossessing our people of family, land, religion and culture. Siblings were placed into varying missions run by church groups. The impacts of these heinous and inhumane acts resulted in the very rupturing of the most essential human emotions such as love, compassion and care. For how could you give love if you were never loved? This became the abhorrent ingrained trauma that now festers in the statistics that state that Noongar people are the highest incarcerated people per head, per population in the world. Suicide is not only rampant in our communities, we now face a human crisis of child-related death due to suicide, whilst countless members of our young people tear their flesh apart. This war takes more lives in this country that are lost on the Gaza Strip. The difference is that the lives lost on the Gaza Strip is constant international news, whilst the death of our young people hardly raises a whisper. Near on 40 years ago, I was 24 years old when I commenced work on the front lines of this war zone in the old Aboriginal Medical Service at an organisation called Killilla. It helped support our people who were suffering from alcohol and substance abuse. I remember seeing the last of the mission kids as they were now young adults trying to link up with families in East Perth, where the inner city campfires burned in such places known as the Bull Paddock, Miller's Cave and the Starlight Hotel. Our people were desperately trying to fight the effects of emotional and psychological warfare as genocide had now entered deep inside the minds, asserting lateral unfettered violence amongst those experiencing the trauma of pain of the after effects of such inhumane policies. These emotional and psychological mental health issues manifested into physical sickness, and many of the people died at early ages from heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure and simple wear and tear. I give them my respects. I worked in a number of Aboriginal organisations. I didn't seem to be able to settle, as most were restricted to being based on service delivery of the concepts of Western models. And in the 1980s in Perth, nepotism was rampant, and as hard as I tried, I just couldn't fit. Black politics during this era was ruthless and brutal in Perth, and I saw many good intentional people give up as their minds and their bodies could take no more of the internalised strategies cleverly played out by the system that turned brother against brother against sister. And it was there that I realised their intent, that around the neck of some of us they hang medals and others they hang nooses. So is the trickery of the white man. 6 organisations later, I applied for the position of the Director of the Dumbartongue Aboriginal Corporation. Such a small organisation that this was the one and only position in the whole service. Today, there are 2. I applied for this position over 30 years ago, 3 decades, and I'm still there to this very day. I remember being asked by the then chairperson, Mr. Jeff Narkle, rest in peace, if I would go in for an interview. It was to be held at what he said was the old Upper West Wing dormitory building of the Clontarf College, the old Catholic orphanage. And I remember laughing to myself and thinking, where in the hell is that? I was offered at the same time a full scholarship to study multimedia at Murdoch University. It was a degree course. I thought about it as my creativity started to merge through my veins. However, I despised the thought of entering ever again any type of educational facility, especially at a tertiary level. I attended the interview, and not long after Mr. Narkle recalled me back in to see him. I remember him saying, well, Robert, although there were a couple of members who really believed that art and culture wasn't your area of interest, and they were concerned about the fact that you were a co-founder of the Black Action Group here in Perth, that you may be better off suited doing something else. However, the majority voted that you be offered the job. I then took out an old brown paper bag that I had in my hip pocket. On it was a sketch of a thought dream that I had about running a cultural gathering. I asked him if Dumbartongue would support this dream, and he said, yes, Robert, it's about culture. I then said, yes, I'll take the position. It was an old brown paper bag that I first took into a old Eggington building which I felt, which had a and I pulled this brown paper bag out and I showed a few of the mob, and they had a look at the design, and they looked at me and they said, you'll never ever do this, Robert. This not only will be far too difficult, but do you think this city's going to allow all these Aboriginal flags to be put up down on the esplanade and the shadow of the city front? And I said, well, whether they do or not, I'm going to do it. 2 years later, the dream from the brown paper bag became the most massive cultural celebration in the living memory of Wimmera people today.
It drew our people together in a circle. You'd have the fire burning, you'd have the spirit existing, you'd have Noongar people, Aboriginal people throughout Australia, and they felt that spirit. They participated, they dwelled in it, they lived in it. We were drinking from a very special pool of what was Aboriginal. It revived us. It allows us to stand up strongly and fight. much more strongly than we had. We were less subservient. We become more of a warrior type community. We were led to resist. The honesty that exists in the Aboriginal community is more about the connections to one another. It's not about competition, it's not about money, it's not about any of those things. Really, it's about how do we communicate and connect us as human beings. I don't think anyone's got a better plan for that than Indigenous people.
Kayana itself as a cultural gathering is what is probably still in living memory for Noongar people, the most important cultural gathering ever held in Noongar country. We had central tributes, themes to the gatherings. In 1991, our central theme was to all Aboriginal people who had died in custodial institutions. It was a burning flame in a rock formation placed centrally within the festival concept, and that was a very important theme because in 1991, that was the year that the federal government also announced the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody.
The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody has produced a final report highly critical of widespread and entrenched racism and the failure of the legal system to protect Aborigines.
So the central themes and the politics of the gatherings were as important as was the cultural significance and the entertainment that the festivals provided for people as well.
And they took the children away, took the children away, the children away, snatched from their mother's breast, said this is for the best, took them away.
I think it symbolised the effort of a dominant system to conform us. And there was this jewel in the crown for us to say no, they could not squash that spirit. Double showed us that we could exist under extreme diversity. I think Dumbledore connected to 40,000 years of knowing how to live. And it had all to do with relationships, they had all to do with connection, how we dealt with the land, how we dealt with one another. The city skyline evaporated. We were back in country.
So that's what we built and we put onto the foreshore of the esplanade in the shadows of the city without them really knowing at all what was happening. So for a moment, if you could just imagine a time when it was so controversial to put one flag, an Aboriginal flag, into the ground in a city like Perth, and the controversy and the reaction that Aboriginal people would get, because in 1991 our flag hadn't been adopted as a national flag through the office of the government's national flag endorsement. So the Aboriginal flag represented our struggle for land rights. It represented that singular and most important struggle, and that's what white Australia fears the most. It doesn't fear migration in terms of how it's today throughout the news talked about in terms of, they're coming. It's the right of the ownership of this land that had been forcibly removed from Aboriginal people that they fear the most. And the Kayana site, as many would know today, has become Elizabeth Keys. It is a playground for middle class, white affluence and privilege. It broke our spirit as they smashed and they sunk the sacred grounds of where Kayana was ceremonially run. They did this and then they named it after the Queen of England. Our culture is a religion. It's the belief system of our old people, and many of our people want to understand the old stories and the customary practice of our ceremonies. We don't want to assimilate into the white man's world. We have our own identity and heritage on this land, the oldest ceremonial grounds on the most ancient landmass on the earth. World religions are weapons of mass destruction. The world's leaders of the most powerful Western countries want you to believe that the wars that now ravish our earth are caused by the extremities of the belief systems of radical idealisms. You'd have to be a late breastfed fool to believe that. As part of our spiritual laws, we never entered over the tribal boundaries of our neighbouring peoples. Our people never knew of war. Our people never knew of famine. Our people ensured that no other life forms were ever threatened by extinction. Our people's main food sources were provided by the 6 seasons and shared by various groups during ceremonial time. Before the tall ships arrived on our shorelines, our people never knew of drunkenness, domestic violence, child sexual abuse. We never knew of prostitution, nor the many other social ills that were introduced and have ravaged the very core of the purity of a living utopia. The world's leading scientific environmentalist, Dr. David Suzuki, stated that we need to, as concerned human beings, immediately commence the right way to live with the earth and how to nurture and protect its living identity. This we can only learn from the Australian Aboriginal people, their values in which they live in total harmony with what they refer to as their first mother. If we don't humble ourselves to this, we will lose the fight to ensure that the earth will be able to sustain life into the future. The Australian government has introduced policies that govern the maintenance of our culture through their funding criteria. These policies industrialise our culture, to dispossess our people from their birthright of ownership. They only fund our culture when they can control its presentation as a form of entertainment in modern Australian auditoriums and those across the world, as a form of business to generate profit from. We witness our special and precious spiritual art stories being sold under the hammers of world's auctions to the wealthiest bidder who will claim the purchase. Our burial sites have become major tourist attractions. They took our flag of resistance that represented our rights to this land, the red, black and yellow, that represented the people, the bloodshed of our great warriors, and the yellow, the sun, the giver of life, and pacified it by registering it under the national flag policy, and it now flies high upon the office towers across the cities, and shire buildings and Parliament House in every state. They have disempowered its strength of representing our struggle for the freedom of political and religious sovereignty. The National Aboriginal and Islander Day of celebrations, commonly named NAIDOC, was once empowered and run by our own community. It is now controlled and engaged by multinational mining companies. It is now engaged by local shires that have pacified it to a form of reconciliation process, where all self-control is being demeaned. The ball that has always concluded NAIDOC is now known in Perth as the Chevron ball. Our traditional language, that is the foundation of our spiritual connections to our old people's way of life, is now taught in educational facilities and sung by non-Aboriginal choirs, as you hear the echoes of the Australian anthem being sung in our ancient tongue. The didgeridoo was a sacred object, only ever seen by men and never women. If women ever saw or heard this object, it was punishable by death. White people believe that assimilation is achieved only when an Aboriginal person is educated to a higher level of consciousness, when his mind is assimilated to an elementary higher than that of barbaric savagery. He believes that all that endeavours to survive outside of his world will ultimately perish. Genocide has gouged our eyes and cut our tongue. We walk in the darkness of despair, cast out like paupers from kingdoms, where our ancestral spirits light the fears of known spiritual entities, where the sounds of familiarity turn strange, creating the fear of spiritual torment and psychological anguish. A never-ending deterioration of the spiritual world of our ancestral songlines, dreams and ceremonies. Our children walk in swamps of mud. Fears of dreams no longer interpreted by the wisdom of our cultural elders. Incarcerated, meant lead forever in his assimilative policies of education and religion. Our elders must take the hands of our young and lead them to the light. I come from a home that was plagued by a unique and a vicious alcohol-fueled domestic violence. It was an extremely volatile and dangerous place to be. As I became older, from 15 years on, I would always be on the streets. One night, escaping from this violence, I remember vividly, at about 17 years old, sitting in the shadow of a massive skyscraper in the inner city of Sydney. My brother, I remember, was on his way to the Armidale University. He became one of the first Aboriginal teachers in New South Wales. I was on my way to my university, up at King's Cross. A different type of teaching and certainly a different type of knowledge. I sat in the shadows and I took an old bank book out from my hip pocket, and with a lead pencil I wrote the words, "A hunger greater than any dream glimpses the beauty, shatters and the ugliness is freed." It must have had something to do with the way that the violence affected my mind. As I looked back in the mud puddle on the side of the road, I glimpsed the reflection of a child, and I thought that the child who hates is the one that loves the most. The deception of globalisation, of democracy being the foundation of nationalism and sovereignty of dominion, stemming from a history of colonial genocide, is a historic deceit of the power to steal the wealth that lay under the ground of the world's Indigenous peoples. The legal sanction of slavery off the west coast African shorelines to the Newfoundlands of America was signed by 3 world signatories. The third, representing the English government, was the King of England. The second, representing the Church of England, was the head of the church. The primary top signature was the man who is seen as the world's greatest moral power, was the Pope. They signed off on the misery, death and the pain of the slave trade. The Aboriginal struggle for this generation is the pride and the knowledge in who we are as a people and where we belong in the vast diversity of all living things. To re-establish the authority and the respect of our elders, so their knowledge and experience can again become the fire sticks through the pain and the suffering, reigniting the ashes of our once great campfires, lighting the way for the unification of our people. The time has now come for you to choose from the beauty of our land or a blood-stained dirty dollar as our planet dies before our eyes. We stand in the shadows of where Dumbarton enacted the smoking ceremony at the Roundhouse, the first Aboriginal response to the first Shire Council that moved towards the changing of the date of the Australian Day celebrations in 2017. Since this inaugural ceremony, there has been a massive movement across Australia to unite in the solidarity of this social and political revolution. And may our campfires burn forever. Maybe just a touch-up.
To the values of before, gain strength from your culture, the spiritual being in war. Seek shelter from the vulture, for colonial oppressor's law, of the presence of gain and spirit, as humanize unite once more.
We listen to the stories as the elders again explain how your culture flourished before the Europeans came. Find why it's important, strength must never wane. Noongas need the spiritual, like dry land needs rain. Sick contemporary tradition come together on stage. Guitars weeping, drums thumping in anguish rage. Hurt, fear, frustration, escape the poets candle. Horn digits echo deep from a forgotten ages. Heard the women dancing and weaving to sing a song. History's miseries from whence your soul belongs. Forget urban landscapes, go back to where you were strong. Search for hidden answers from which your spirit belongs. Here with me, black performance caused by crowds to sway. Soulful resonant lyrics put broken hearts on display. But words of hope and freedom offered a brand new day. As they like kisses, darkness, children, life dancing. Kaya Kayana means to survive. Kaya Kayana, for which Noongar strive. Kaya Kayana, culture on display. Kaya Kayana, celebrating indigenous way. Kaya Kayana means to survive. Kaya Kayana, for which Noongar strive. Kaya Kayana, culture on display. Kaya Kayana, celebrating indigenous way. Yo, we've been through the worst, till we soldier on. Still the culture's strong, beats to my brother still holds it on. Stay staunch when you're told you're wrong. Pretty mad if you roll along. We need more love for all of the brothers up in the forefront, showing us how we should all love. It's all love if you want more, cause you see the whips. We spit the beats, but we need release. Believe for me, I sing the streets, but I know there's a better way for my brothers now. Keep the family born strong and my cousins round, cause I'm proud that you family man. You done a lot more than your family can, and that's the kind of stuff that will warm my heart. Noongar showing strength and unity when we're torn apart. All we need to really do is form a start. Knowledge is where I fall apart, I saw a spot. Kaya Kayana means to survive. Kaya Kayana, for which Noongar strive. Kaya Kayana, culture on display. Kaya Kayana, celebrating indigenous way. It means to survive, for which Noongar strive. Our culture on display, celebrating indigenous way. Moves down south, straight holding down, making a man proud when he kick it with ground. To the youngsters up north, you my brothers of course. Even the those strong intellect from the source. To the long glass out mid, straight living up off the grid. I ain't been there in a minute, but I visit with kids. And to the crews out east, my brothers you straight face. It's time for us to speak, so come and sing it with me. Hey, Kaya Kayana means to survive. Kaya Kayana, for which Noongar strive. Kaya Kayana, culture on display. Kaya Kayana, celebrating indigenous way. Kaya Kayana means to survive. Kaya Kayana, for which Noongar strive. Kaya Kayana, culture on display. Kaya Kayana, celebrating indigenous way. May our campfires burn forever.